welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. I am Andrew Gustafson, and we'll give people just a couple minutes to continue joining. As always, we do have closed captioning available at the bottom of your screen, and Brian is joining us today in the chat. So if you have any questions, we encourage you to drop them in there. And we also want to know if anybody has any connections to today's program. Maybe some of you actually flew on Concorde at some point. I'll say that I never had the opportunity to, though I have been aboard Concorde at the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum. I wanted to give folks a little bit of background on today's program. So today we are talking about Concorde. We're talking about the supersonic passenger jetliner. Why are we talking about this? What does this have to do with New York? Well, for one, I wanted to do this as an angle, not give you the whole history of Concorde, because I am not the expert on that. And as I've learned in the course of developing this program, there are so many experts about Concorde, and there's so much amazing information. It's probably the most documented aircraft in history. And so we're going to share a lot of those resources with you in the chat and after the program. But I have a personal connection to Concorde. As you know, Concorde was not a regular sort of going on vacation or commuter aircraft. It was really a specialty aircraft for largely for business travelers and celebrities, because just the expense of it was so far out of reach for ordinary people to be able to afford its service. My father, who worked in the corporate world, he worked for Black & Decker, he got to fly on Concorde, and so I have this on my desk, which was his certificate for his first flight on Concorde, which you can see was on January 24th, 1981. And over the course of his career, he actually flew on Concorde more than 60 times. He's no longer with us. Otherwise, I would love to have him on and talk about the experience of flying on Concorde. But I'll share a few of the stories that he shared with me over the years. And I also have a lot of Concorde swag. Concorde, because it was so expensive, was really about selling an image, selling an experience, and branding the respective airlines, British Airways and Air France. And so they gave you a lot of swag, and I have a lot of that. I'll share some of it with you. So, you know, I use a lot of Concorde pens. I have a Concorde wallet. I still use all this stuff. And if you didn't get a chance to fly on Concorde but want to say that you did, I have a few blank flight certificates of Concorde. So you can doctor your own Concorde flight certificate if you have one of these. So we'll share a few of those things, but we'll also give you the kind of broader history of the aircraft and its connection to New York. So it wasn't built in New York. It wasn't designed in New York. This was an entirely European project, but New York was really central to Concorde's story for a couple of reasons. Number one, New York to London and to Paris was the longest running and most successful route of Concorde. So Concorde was really synonymous with JFK Airport for the vast majority of its service life. But also, it wasn't just the people who could afford to fly in Concorde and the people who designed it who impacted its destiny, but also people on the ground in communities in Queens, especially around JFK Airport. And so we're going to talk about the battles over Concorde relating to the noise. And those battles, you know, continued right up until the moment Concorde service was discontinued in 2003. I can see some people dropped in here. Marilyn said, I was at Jamaica Bay looking through a bird blind and saw Concorde taking off from JFK from the bird blind. So I'm sure, and Howard says, I actually had one flight on Concorde. Oh, great. So thanks so much. Keep those stories coming. And maybe if we have time at the end, we'll give folks the opportunity to share more. So let's start with the beginning and give you a little background on this aircraft, because it really was a remarkable piece of engineering. And also, even though it is the only, well, I shouldn't say that, it is one of only two operational commercial supersonic passenger airplanes. In terms of its design and especially its production, it really set a template that the aircraft industry still uses to this day. So it was really groundbreaking in a lot of different ways. You know, what I mentioned before was that the Concorde was so much about image and about branding, and when you look at the profile of this aircraft, it's really just so remarkable. So obviously, it wasn't the first supersonic aircraft. This said the sound barrier was first broken in 1947. By Chuck Yeager, and there were many supersonic military aircraft. But with a passenger aircraft, there were a lot of other obstacles that you had to overcome and other details you had to worry about that you didn't have to with a military aircraft. And some of the big ones that we're going to talk about are heat, sound, vibration, and just the general comfort of the passengers on board Concorde. But when they went through the initial design phase, it was determined that the best way to achieve the speeds they were trying to achieve over Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, was with this delta wing configuration that you see here. And this has really become we're going to see a few different examples of SST's supersonic transports. But they basically all use this delta wing configuration. It's also not a surprise that this was a British and French design, and the British were really enamored with delta wing aircraft. And so it grew out of a number of different earlier designs for military aircraft as well. And so, you know, developing a supersonic transport, this was something that many countries were thinking about. And actually, France and Britain sort of started to go down this path independently, but ultimately determined that it was far too expensive for one country of their size to develop it all on their own. And so they decided to work together. And so they signed the Concorde Treaty on November 29th, 1962, that begins this collaboration. And like I said, this really set the template for building a international supply chain for building aircraft, which is basically how all the large aircraft, civilian aircraft in the world are built today. And so this idea became kind of a sensation, and airlines all around the world began ordering, I shouldn't say ordering, what these are what are called options. So basically this gives you the option to buy the aircraft once it's available, but does not obligate you to buy it or make you put down a deposit. And so you can see there were actually 16 airlines around the world that were interested in buying it. Two of them were the national airlines of the two countries that were building Concorde. You have British Airways and Air France that were each ordering 8. But you can see there's one other company that was also ordering 8, and that was Pan Am. So they would bring the SST to the United States. So Pan Am, not around anymore today, but it really was the major player in American passenger airlines. And so Juan Trippe, the head of Pan Am, was the first actually to announce orders or options for the Concorde in June 1963. Actually, it was on June 3rd, I believe. And this incensed President Kennedy because he could not believe that this company that was sort of one of the American champions would invest essentially in this European project at the expense of the American aircraft industry. And so President Kennedy was so upset by this that just 2 days later, he goes and gives the commencement speech at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and he announces an American SST program. So we're going to listen to his remarks here at commencement.
In this area, today the challenging new frontier in commercial aviation and in military aviation is a frontier already crossed by the military. Supersonic flight. Leading members of the administration under the chairmanship of the Vice President, have been considering carefully the role to be played by the national government in determining the economic and technical feasibility of an American commercial supersonic aircraft and in the development of such an aircraft if it be feasible. Having reviewed their recommendations, it is my judgment that this government should immediately commence a new program in partnership with private industry to develop at the earliest practical date the prototype of a commercially successful supersonic transport superior to that being built in any other country of the world.
So we know, obviously everybody knows Kennedy's famous speech about going to the moon. And in many ways, the Concorde program was Europe's Apollo program. But Kennedy also, set out goals for America to build its own SST as well. But there's a few caveats in there. He says, if feasible, if commercially viable. So what happened to this American SST?
In this area.
Sorry. So what happened to this project? Well, there were several prototype designs that were made, and several companies actually submitted designs to this competition. And the winner of this competition would get a lot of public subsidies. And of course, Concorde was completely funded by the national governments. All told, the program was close. It cost close to $3 billion in 1960s money, which would, I guess, be about 10 times that amount today. So it was a significant investment, much smaller than the Apollo program, but still a large investment for those countries. And so the idea was to also lavish the American SST program with public subsidies. And so this is the design that won that initial competition, which is the Boeing 2707. It was much larger and designed to be faster, but you can see that the basic shape of it is roughly the same. And we're going to talk a little bit about issues of espionage and copying designs, but some of it comes down to sometimes there are only certain solutions to engineering problems, especially when you're operating with the constraints of materials and design and production feasibility of the time. So that long, sleek design and that delta wing is also what the Boeing design came up with. But there was a third contender for the SST as well, and that was the Tupolev Tu-144. I've also seen this aircraft. I've never been aboard it and never flew on it because it stopped flying actually before I was born. But this was the Soviet Union's entry into this competition. Also larger than Concorde, but again, very, very similar design. And actually, this is the first supersonic passenger airliner. This actually started flying 1 month before Concorde took passengers. So the Soviets beat the Europeans into the air, but it did not have a very long career. So what happened to these competing SST programs? So let's start with the American program. So one of the first steps of this program laid out by President Kennedy was to look at the impact of sonic booms. So this is one of the big challenges that you have to overcome if you're going to build a supersonic airliner, is that there's constant noise hitting the ground, usually within a corridor about 25 miles wide. So it's not like when the plane crosses the sound barrier, there's a crack and then it's smooth sailing. It's a continuous sound over the entire flight path when it's in supersonic flight. And so we didn't really understand what the impacts of this would be. So unfortunately, the people of Oklahoma City were subjected to several months of testing by the US military. So from February 3rd to July 30th, 1964, they flew over 1,000 supersonic flights over Oklahoma City. The program was actually supposed to go through August, but they stopped it early because there were so many complaints and lawsuits and a court injunction over the impact of this. So this image actually comes from a pamphlet that was distributed to the poor residents of Oklahoma City to explain, how this whole process was going to work and what the sonic boom was, but it was just constant noise. And so basically this set a few different things in motion. For one, it questioned the feasibility, the practicability of ever having supersonic flight over land, because you were just going to constantly be bombarding all the people on the ground with this noise. The other thing that happened was this is really what started the anti-supersonic movement that would raise a lot of legitimate public safety, public health concerns, and also raise a lot of probably illegitimate ones about the damage that supersonic flight could do to people, and that's something that we'll come back to in the following decade in the 1970s, because this is these issues are central to the fight over getting Concorde into JFK and having service out of New York. So this kind of starts the ball rolling in the anti-supersonic movement. And also, if you're going to have an American aircraft that's going to fly supersonically between American destinations, it has to fly over land. So how feasible could this aircraft actually be if it's not going to fly over land? And so ultimately what killed off the American SST was President Nixon. So after about 7 years of subsidies being given to this program and to Boeing, in 1971, they canceled the program. And then shortly after that, in 1973, Congress actually bans supersonic commercial flights over land in the United States. Here we actually have, shortly after the announcement was made that they were killing the SST program, or I guess that was made several months earlier, back in March, but this is in December 1971, and the president of France, Georges Pompidou, actually met with Nixon at the Azores, and Pompidou arrived via one of the Air France Concorde prototypes, and Nixon actually got a little tour aboard and said, maybe we made a mistake in giving up on this program. He was so impressed by the aircraft. So that's the end of America's supersonic ambitions. What happened to the Soviet plane? So the Tu-144, again, you can see a lot of similarities between it and Concorde, and one of the key similarities, we can see one key similarity and one key difference in this photo. So the similarity is essentially, for a supersonic aircraft to be stable, you want to have it be as pointed as possible. That's not just for the aircraft stability and for speed, but also because it's building up a tremendous amount of heat and pressure as those sound pressure waves build up on the nose of the aircraft. So the pointier it is, the better you're going to be able to navigate through that and dissipate that heat. However, when you're essentially flying a missile, it's really, really hard for the pilots to see when you have to take off and land. And so for both Concorde and the Tu-144, also known as the Concorde ski, they developed this droop nose. So it would lower into this position so that the pilots could actually see the ground, and then would raise up when they go into level supersonic flight. And so what were the origins of this design? Was this stolen from one country and used in the other country's design? Or was this simply two design teams arriving at the a similar solution to the same problem. There were certainly instances of industrial espionage on both sides, but there were certainly Soviet agents that had infiltrated the Concorde program, and some of them were actually expelled from the country. So who's to say? However, there was a design that the Soviets developed that was not included on Concorde that was quite novel. And that's we see what are called canard wings, these two little winglets that stick out at the top. And again, they're great for stability, having canard wings, but not great for high-speed flight. And so they were actually retractable. And what this did, it was quite a nice design because it actually allowed the Tu-144 to land and take off at a shallower angle, giving the pilots a better view of the ground. And so it was able to maintain better stability at low speeds. So a pretty good design. And actually, the designer of the Concorde said that if there ever was a second iteration, a Concorde B, that it's very possible they would have incorporated this type of retractable canard design into it. But unfortunately, Tu-144 was really plagued by safety problems, and they never could solve a lot of the issues of stability. Concorde itself had so many different systems to keep the aircraft cool and stable. One of them was that it has to carry a lot of fuel, and so the fuel, as it's depleted, will move the center of gravity. So Concorde was constantly pumping fuel into different compartments to maintain its center of gravity and maintain level flight. So Tu-144 had a lot of problems with its stability, and unfortunately had a couple crashes, one of them very, very high profile. Before it even went into commercial service, in 1973, it was flying at the Paris Air Show, and when doing a maneuver, it crashed and killed all those on board and some people on the ground as well. So this was supposed to be its kind of coming out to the international community, and it ended in tragedy. There are some theories that actually the crash was caused in part by the aircraft trying to avoid a French spy plane that was flying in the area, trying to get pictures actually of the canard wings. And so they had to make an evasive maneuver, and that's what caused the crash. So there's a lot of different theories about what caused the crash of Tu-144, but it started off its career on a very sad note. 1975, December 1975 is when it goes into commercial service. And again, the Soviets had ambitions of having service that would connect the vast Soviet Union, but also have international destinations as well. So you can see Tu-44 flying to New York and Havana, as well as to Delhi and to Japan. None of this ever came to be. The only commercial flights that it did with passengers were between Moscow and Almaty in Kazakhstan. And it actually only ever flew 55 times with passengers, and it never had a full load of passengers because of concerns over weight and stability. And then it suffered another crash, luckily not with passengers aboard, but in 1978, it crashed again, and that really what ended its service. And 5 years after that, the whole program was canceled. So very, very short service life. And like you can see in this photo, that I took back here, there are a number of examples that are still existing. So this is at Monumental Field, which is outside of Moscow. Okay, so we talked about a lot of the engineering challenges of building Concorde. And one of them that I mentioned was heat, and trying to figure out a way to dissipate the heat, because you can see that the fuselage would get very, very hot. So they had to develop use some new aluminum alloys, because building the whole aircraft out of titanium would have just been prohibitively expensive. And so this enormous engineering challenge had to be undertaken before the era of computer-aided design, and it had to be done by teams in 2 different countries that spoke 2 different languages and used 2 different systems of measurement. And so one of the first things they had to overcome actually was the name. The British, the name Concorde comes from the word concord, like an agreement. And so this was meant to signify, the historic friendship of, at least in the 20th century, between France and Britain, the Entente Cordiale. And some people in Britain actually wanted to drop the E, and the French were insistent that the E be stuck on there. And so the E remained as a compromise. But the other compromise was that this was a publicly funded project, and so they wanted it to support the domestic aerospace industries in their respective countries. And so the project was basically 50-50 between France and Britain, but not every component was 50-50. So the airframe was actually about 60% French, 40% British, and the engines were 60% British, 40% France. And you can see the breakdown of this aircraft and where the different components came from. So you can see the different factories, and half of the aircraft would be undergo final assembly in Britain. Those would be the aircraft for British Airways, and half of the aircraft would be assembled in France, those for Air France. Now, I mentioned that half of the aircraft are going to Air France and half are going to British Airways. What happened to all of those other orders? There were more than 70 aircraft that were optioned. Well, they started canceling their orders in 1972, in part because of, number one, the movement against supersonic flight over land. And so the number of routes that could feasibly be flown by Concorde shrink dramatically. And number two was simply the cost of operating, especially as we get into the early 1970s. We're entering the period of oil crisis. And so the operating costs for most of these airlines were just astronomical. And so they decided that Concorde just wasn't worth it. And so the only airlines that thought that it was worth it were the airlines owned by the countries that were investing billions of dollars into developing the aircraft. Now, I mentioned that one of the breakthroughs of Concorde was developing this international supply chain. So they would build components in all these different factories, as you can see here, and then bring them for final assembly, whether in Toulouse or in France, or in Filton in the UK, and fit it together, and somehow fit it together despite doing their design and manufacturing with different measurement systems and in different languages. They found a way to put it together. So it wasn't just overcoming the engineering challenges to make something work, it was overcoming all of these logistics and manufacturing challenges as well to put the aircraft together. And this is something that we still see today. So really, Concorde is the beginning of Airbus, which would be a European consortium that has suppliers from all over the European Union. And you can see how an Airbus aircraft is put together today. So you can see wings from the UK, engine pylons from France, the center fuselage from Germany, and it even has parts from the United States. And actually today, there's an Airbus assembly plant in Mobile, Alabama. They make very few parts in the United States, but they actually transport all of these components to the US to assemble them. And the same can be said for Boeing as well, which has a highly globalized supply chain. So this really all started with Concorde. And here you can see this is what that assembly process looked like. This is at the Filton assembly plant, the UK assembly plant. I will just give a shout out to some of the incredible resources that I used in developing this program, and learned so much. Like I said, this is one of the most documented aircraft in the world. And so we'll share some links to some of those websites, including Heritage Concorde and Concorde SST. And there is even a Concorde History magazine, which you can read online, called Mach 2. So all of the issues are online, and some really great articles about the history and profiling crews and other people related to the project. Yeah, so we get to the early 1970s, and the first production or the first aircraft goes into production in 1965, and then we have our first test flights in 1969. But then by the early 1970s, really the demand for Concorde has dropped off significantly, and we really just have two players that are operating it. And so Concorde makes its first commercial flights in 1976. A lot of the history of Concorde is about synchronizing flights. And again, this is meant to be a 50-50 partnership between Britain and France. So they never would want, one aircraft to arrive before the other. And so there was all of this coordination in the flight operations, in addition to the manufacturing between the two partners. And so the initial flights are destinations you probably wouldn't expect for Concorde. So they inaugurated two new services. So Air France inaugurated service from Paris to Rio de Janeiro. And you can see some interesting things about the flight paths. First, where you see a dotted line, it's flying over land, so it's in subsonic flight. And second, the range of Concorde was not huge. And so in many cases, they would have to make refueling stops. So in this case, they would stop in Dakar. And for the British, you can see they have a much longer dotted line there. They have to cross basically all of Europe to get to the Adriatic Sea before they can fly over water and sort of make a little bit of a circuitous route through the Mediterranean and then across Saudi Arabia to get to Bahrain. And actually, in later iterations of the Bahrain service, you would see a dotted line when they're passing over the Arabian Peninsula as well. They had to drop down to subsonic flight. So when we think about Concorde service, we think about really three airports: New York, London, and Paris. And maybe going back to the 90s, you think about Washington Dulles. And in fact, there were only 12 airports in the entire world that saw regularly scheduled commercial service on Concorde. So not a huge number of destinations that they were able to service. And in many cases, these were sort of, there was subsonic flight to get to that destination ultimately. So there were a few American destinations that you maybe didn't know about or think about. One was Miami. So they had a stopover in Washington and then went to Miami. Another was Dallas, again, stopping over in Washington and going to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. And then the only other airline to ever have a branded Concorde was actually Singapore Air. So Bahrain was the stopover point for Singapore. That was part of the reason why they did this route first, because they saw Bahrain as sort of the gateway to East Asia for Concorde. There was a short-lived Singapore service, but by 1980 that was discontinued due to lack of demand. Okay, so they start off slow with these routes, and then Concorde makes its first entree into the United States in 1973 is when we actually have the first Concorde lands in the United States, and it lands in Dallas, actually. Interestingly, Dallas would have a weird kind of role to play in the story of Concorde, which we'll get to in a couple minutes with Braniff Airlines. But 1973, it makes the first landing in the United States. And then in 1975, British Airways and Air France announced that they want to begin service to the United States. They file notice to the FAA, and that's when the FAA begins doing a series of noise studies, and there's a lot of pushback against Concorde. So on February 4th, 1976, the FAA chair, William Coleman, basically allows Concorde to fly into the United States, and it has its first service that started later that year in May to DC. And this is considered a trial period, a 16-month trial. So they're going to collect data for 12 months about noise and pollution from Concorde. And then they'll do 4-month analysis of that data. And then they will make their final decision. But the New York Port Authority doesn't want to wait for the decision of the FAA. And so in March of that year, so just about a month after the FAA announcement, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey banned supersonic flight from any of its airports. And so this kicks off a battle that would play out in the courtrooms and on the streets of Queens over the future of Concorde and it coming to New York City. So there would be a whole series of protests and a number of protest groups that would grow up around blocking Concorde. And we can see one of their tactics that they used was actually to try and clog the airports with cars. So starting in the spring of 1977, they had a series of 3 or 4 of these where hundreds of people just drove through the airports at about 5 miles an hour to just clog up traffic as a way to protest Concorde. And they got a sort of champion in this fight, and that was Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin. And so he went out to Queens and talked to people in Howard Beach and became kind of convinced that the Concorde was a menace and shouldn't come to New York, and that all these powerful European countries and their high-priced lawyers were basically ruining the lives of the people of Queens. And so he did a whole series of columns about Concorde, and then he even rode on Concorde himself. So in April 1977, he actually took the QE2 to France, met with some French officials there, and then he flew back on Concorde. Unfortunately for Concorde, the plane actually suffered mechanical difficulty, its first mechanical difficulty of its commercial service, and had to make an emergency landing in Halifax. So the one person that they really had to convince that this was a good idea really wasn't convinced, had a really bad experience on Concorde. And so this fight continued to play out in the courts, and we can see a number of different activist groups that were started. This guy here on the right is, his name is escaping me, Brian. Anyway, he was a lawyer and one of the leaders of the fight against it. Another group was called ROAR, or Reclaiming Our American Rights, was the name of the group that were trying to block the SST. And so a court battle ensued. And so March 1976, the Port Authority says, we're not letting Concorde in. Over a year later, in May of 1977, a judge named Milton Pollack basically says that this was unconstitutional, that the Port Authority didn't have the authority to do this. And so that opened the way for British Airways and Air France to come into New York. This ruling was upheld by the Supreme Court on October 17th, and actually just 2 days later is when they start their test flights. Now, again, they wanted to be sensitive to these communities and understood that there's a tremendous amount of noise that was generated by these aircraft. And so they had to develop a special maneuver for flying out of JFK. So they would fly out of runway 31L, and they would have to make this sharp left turn, again, all under subsonic flight, in order to minimize the number of people that they flew over. So basically make this tight circle so they could keep most of their flight path within Jamaica Bay, pass over the Rockaway Peninsula, and then they were out over the ocean. Now, I should say that the concern was not just about the aircraft engines in supersonic flight. At subsonic flight, they were also extremely loud. And the FAA actually installed a number of sound sensors, and they had to fall below a certain threshold. I believe it was 112 decibels they had to fall below. And here you can see the first test flights that were done just 2 days after the Supreme Court opened the door for Concorde's arrival in New York on October 19th, 1977. Again, they did a series of test flights and practiced this maneuver over Jamaica Bay. Not everybody was convinced, though. About a month later, on November 22nd, is when commercial service starts. Again, between London and Paris and New York, they coordinated landings within 90 seconds of each other of a BA plane and an Air France plane. So it has to be a 50-50 partnership, but not everybody was convinced. So I want to play for you a little news clip of some of the protesters at the inaugural commercial flight of Concorde into New York. And their numbers had dwindled quite a bit from earlier in the year.
May be the fastest, most advanced way to cross the Atlantic, but those who live near the runways at Kennedy Airport claim it's just the noisiest plane in the world. And as the British Airways supersonic jet made its graceful approach to New York today over the roofs of their homes, some of them were out to make yet another protest. The protesters had hoped to picket all 5 approach roads to the airport, but the turnout was small, several points were uncovered, and their appeal to airport workers not to cross the picket lines was ignored. But it has met the noise standards, the noise limits set by Kennedy Airport.
No, it hasn't, because it has diverted itself. It knows where the black boxes are. They had a prescribed course, and they have not had they had a simulated situation which is not with the conditions that they are.
But commercial flights do start today. Doesn't this mean that in effect you've lost?
No, we haven't lost. We never lose. The American people will never lose, because the American people have been fighters all their lives.
But despite the opposition, Europe was suddenly 4 hours closer to New York as Air France made the first historic landing of a supersonic commercial flight at Kennedy Airport. One minute, 30 seconds later, Britain's Concorde was brought in by Captain Walpole for another perfect touchdown. The 2 planes taxied together for 300 yards across the airfield before peeling off to their respective terminals. Supersonic transport for fare-paying passengers had at last arrived at New York. British Airways had, in the words of their deputy chairman, taken the real bite of the Big Apple.
So I just love that the protester saying that we never lose, and the fight would continue against Concorde, and we'll talk about how it picks up again in the early 2000s. But so again, this is the iconic routes of Concorde: New York and Paris, or London and Paris to New York. But I mentioned that there were some other routes as well that started to develop. And so we mentioned the Singapore route, and then we also mentioned the Dallas route. And this is a concept drawing. This aircraft actually was never painted in this way. But if you remember Braniff Airlines, they actually got in on Concorde and actually did fly Concorde. But it was such a convoluted kind of arrangement that they had. For one, you weren't allowed to fly supersonic commercial aircraft over land. So the entire leg from Washington to Dallas would have to be subsonic. Number 2, you couldn't operate, because of regulation, you couldn't operate a European-owned aircraft between 2 American destinations. And so what they actually did was, when the plane landed in Washington, they would sign papers selling the aircraft to Braniff, and Braniff crews would then fly it to Dallas for that last leg, which literally saved a matter of minutes over a conventional flight between Washington and Dallas. So the Braniff service is kind of this funny little quirk that only lasted for about 18 months. But I thought I would just mention that if folks remember Braniff Airlines. But so over time, these other routes just sort of fade away because of lack of customers, and it was so expensive to operate. And so Washington would stick around until 1994. And then that service would be discontinued, and then we would just have our New York route. The other thing, though, to keep in mind, I mentioned that there were 12 airports that saw scheduled service from Concorde, but there were well over 100 airports that saw charter service. So that was actually a big part of the business for Air France and BA, was chartering flights to destinations all around the world. And it was actually a charter flight that had a big impact on Concorde's fate. But we can't talk about Concorde without talking about again the experience, which is really what they were selling. In addition to the speed, at the prices that you were paying, and I believe I have this right. In 2003, when the last service of Concorde was, it was a round trip flight was about $12,000 on British Airways. So again, out of reach for most people, and a lot of people that were flying on Concorde weren't paying their own way. They were business people, and so they relied a huge amount on corporate business. But they still wanted people to feel like they were getting at least some of their money's worth, and so they were famous for their remarkable menus and food. And so if you go to some of these Concorde history websites, you can find a lot of these menus shared there. And of course, the experience of flying supersonic, you would see your airspeed was displayed in the cabin. One thing, though, is that they didn't completely overcome the issues of heating, because the cabin would actually get quite warm because the skin of the aircraft was getting superheated as they passed through the atmosphere. In the few minutes we have left, I want to share a couple other stories, interesting stories about Concorde's connection to New York, because we did have a Concorde sort of permanently stationed in New York, right in the heart of New York in Times Square. This is a Concorde model that was erected in 1996. This is actually a half-size model. It was built by a company in Texas, and then assembled in pieces right on 42nd Street and 7th Avenue. This building isn't there anymore. This model was removed in 2001 when they tore down the building. But it was really this icon of Times Square for a long time. The other thing was that everyone coming out of the Midtown Tunnel into Manhattan would see this massive Concorde billboard. So really, marketing in New York was a huge part of Concorde's business, especially for British Airways. So this is actually a remarkable model that's still around. It's still intact. After it was taken down in 2001, it was given to the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Long Island. And then just last year or 2 years ago, it was taken by the Empire State Aerosciences Museum, which is in Schenectady. And they've been working to actually put it on display in front of their museum. It's been slowed down a little bit because of COVID, but you can go and see this in Schenectady in the near future. But Concorde, of course, faced some challenges. And the biggest challenge happened on July 25th, 2000, when this tragic scene happened at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Now, they had been examining Concordes and inspecting them, and had noticed some issues with some cracking of the airframe, but nothing that was very significant. But this crash occurred when basically they suffered some severe tire damage, that ignited the engines and caused them to lose 2 engines and crash and killed 109 people, both on the aircraft and on the ground. And this was actually a charter flight on its way to New York. And this obviously led to the grounding of all the Concordes around the world. And this reignited the fight in New York to stop Concorde from ever coming back. And so Concordes were out of service for a little, almost a year and a half. And during that time period, one of the people leading the fight of stopping Concorde from ever coming back to New York was the congressman for that area of Southeast Queens, Anthony Weiner. And so Anthony Weiner spoke out against it. Here he is actually several years later when the Concorde that's now at the Intrepid was temporarily housed at Floyd Bennett Field while the Intrepid ship itself was in dry dock. So he did go and visit the Concorde, even though 5 years before he was the one fighting against it. And so in 2003 November 5th, 2003 is when we have the final flight of Concorde from New York City. And that's the end of the service. It had its last flights anywhere in the world just a couple of weeks later. And really this was driven by costs, the age of the airframe and the cost to maintain them so that they could be completely safe was just not worth it for the airlines. And of course the increasing costs of fuel as well for operating them. So that was kind of the end of Concorde after 27 years of commercial service. The Concordes were kind of distributed to museums around the world, and we were lucky enough to get one in New York, and fittingly a British Airways aircraft. You can see here it says GBOAD. This is the designation of the aircraft, of this specific aircraft. So you can go online and you can see the service history of this aircraft specifically. And so it was taken from JFK by barge up through the Narrows and then to Intrepid on the west side of Manhattan. And for a long time, it was actually on a barge on display. And then in 2005, 2006 is when they dry docked Intrepid and brought this barge down to Floyd Bennett Field. And then after it returned, it was put on display actually on the pier where you can go and visit it. So it's one of my favorite things to visit at Intrepid. A really, really cool experience and really great tours. I don't think that they've resumed their Concorde tours yet, but when they do, I highly recommend going to check it out. So we have a piece of Concorde history here in New York again, and this city, like I said, played such an important role in the story of that aircraft. So I have been able to go on board Concorde this one time at the Intrepid, and so you can see it was not a huge aircraft. It was pretty cramped space inside because of the constraints of having to build a Mach 2 missile that could reasonably comfortably carry 100 passengers in it. Now, when Concorde went out of service in 2003, that was the end of supersonic passenger service, but it may be coming back. I just wanted to mention, and one of the reasons, another inspiration for this project, for this program, was an announcement a few weeks ago about the timeline for this boom technology. So this is a company that's based out in Colorado that is developing a new supersonic airliner. NASA has actually been working quite extensively on how to mitigate the issues of the sonic boom over land. And they found that by adjusting the shape of the airframe, as well as repositioning the engines, that they can actually dissipate it quite significantly and may be able to overcome opposition and FAA regulations over that. So there may be a future for overland flight for supersonic jetliners, and Boom is really banking on this, and they're hoping that they could fly to hundreds of destinations around the world with their aircraft, and they're hoping to have a workable, flyable aircraft within the next 5 years. And a number of companies have already expressed interest, like you can see United here, in purchasing the aircraft when it becomes available. So the story of supersonic flight is not over yet. Although we're now approaching the 20-year mark where we haven't had any of these aircraft in service. So that kind of brings us up to the present day and the end of our story. But if anyone has any questions or comments that you'd like to share. Okay, so I see some questions here. All right, so my mother actually asked a question about an emergency landing in Gander. As I mentioned, our father is no longer with us, and he had so many flights on Concorde that something was bound to happen, and there was we couldn't remember the story exactly, and I've tried to track it down, but he was on an aircraft that landed in an emergency landing. And there was an emergency landing of a Concorde at Gander in the year 2000. But I feel like the incident that he described to us happened a little bit earlier than that. So we know it happened sometime between 1981, his first flight, and 2003, but we haven't been able to exactly track down the details. So my mother and I have still been going through my father's stuff and some of his papers to see if we can find some more of this kind of memorabilia. The question here is, did they need extra long runways to land? Not really. So most conventional runways for large international airports were totally adequate. And I mentioned that over 100 different airports had Concorde land or take off from them. Some of them were on purpose, as they were charter destinations, and in some cases they had to be diverted. So Gander is one example. That is a super long runway up in Newfoundland. But one of the primary diversion airports, if the airports in New York were fogged in for Concorde, was Bradley International Airport in Hartford. So Concorde actually landed at Bradley a bunch of times, and it does have a pretty long runway, but it's not unusually long. Yeah. So if anyone has any other questions, I'm just going through the chat here to see if I missed anything. So yeah, so the passengers, about 100 passengers, and we got to see pictures of the interior. But yeah, so I just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us. I'll just show you a couple other pieces of Concorde memorabilia that I have in my collection. So this is just a postcard, but I've actually saved some pieces of Concorde stationery, and over the last 20 years, I've very slowly used it. So if you ever get a letter from me and it's on Concorde stationery, if you can see the embossing down at the bottom, you know that it's pretty special, because I ration this stuff out because I don't know where you can get it. Although maybe someday it'll be like the TWA, with the TWA hotel at JFK Airport. They have so much branded TWA stuff that they have there. Although apparently they had to take a lot of it out of the rooms because everybody was just stealing it when they stayed in the hotels. My sister Amanda got to stay in the TWA hotel last year. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciated the opportunity to share this story. And obviously this isn't something that we can share on an in-person tour at the Navy Yard or the Army Terminal or Prospect Park. And obviously this is something that has special meaning for myself and my family. But join us for our next program. So we're going to have our family programs with the Brooklyn Public Library starting July 5th. And also next week, we'll be announcing our whole slate of programs for July into August. So stay tuned. I know the calendar is a little thin right now, but we're going to be filling it out as we're making some final arrangements with different partners and guests. So we're really excited. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.